The work that I'm going to talk about is a product of contributions from people from University of Sydney, Queensland University of Technology, UQ, JCU, AIMS, and 3 different parts of CSIRO. There's a whole lot of different people involved in this, and a lot of the work that we're doing is actually building on previous projects or work that's been funded from other places, and essentially trying to take scientific research and give it a pathway into the actual application in a management program. So it's a big and complex picture. We've recognised Crown-of-Thorns Starfish as a threat to coral health on the GBR for a long time now, and that's resulted since the 1960s in a lot of effort being invested into research into understanding the species, its ecology, its biology, and the origins and causes of outbreaks, but also a huge amount of effort focused on actually managing populations in the field. And that investment in the field and in research is continuing today. When you look at the GBR, it's pretty easy to feel a bit pessimistic about the chances of success. As you're all aware, the GBR is a huge area, thousands of reefs stretched along a vast area of the Queensland coast. And it's complex. Some of it's shallow, some of it's deep, some of it's remote. And the abundance of crown-of-thorns in any one of these sections at different times can be huge. Tens of millions of animals in relatively small areas. And lined up against this, using our current technologies and approaches, today we've got 2 boats which do about 50 voyages a year, and on those voyages 10 or 12 divers get out and kill individual animals, one by one. You look at that and you think, how could that possibly succeed? Now, that's a pessimistic view on it, but you can also be a bit more of an optimist, and you can say, well, we actually have recognised that we've got a problem. We do have resources available for research, we do have resources available for control, and we actually have quite skilled control teams operating out in the field. Another thing is that not all of the GBR is outbreaking at any point in time. Usually it's a section 100, 150 kilometres or so of the reef. So perhaps it's a little more manageable than we originally might think on the face of it. And also, we're not necessarily trying to get rid of Crown-of-Thorns starfish. We're really trying to reduce their impacts. So we don't need to eradicate these animals and get every single vast one. So in that optimistic view, you might think that if we take a much more strategic approach to management, if we really think about the underlying ecological processes and how they play out in the field and how management interacts with those processes, then it might actually stand some chance of being able to manage outbreaks in an acceptable fashion. And that's basically what we've been trying to do in this particular program of research. We're trying to identify how you might go about managing the crown-of-thorns in the field with today's technology, but with an eye to future technologies as well, and to then identify the research programs that will support success in that field. So the first step in this process was really to outline a management strategy. Given what we know about Crown-of-Thorns starfish, how would you go about managing that given the tools we have available and the tools we think we might have available in the future? Now, to do that, you need to have a picture of how Crown-of-Thorns starfish processes are operating. You need to understand how management might interact with that, and you need to redesign management to take into account those ecological processes more explicitly. So in the first phase of this work, we went through that sort of a process, we built those kinds of models, and we then identified where in the process research would be, management would be best intervening, and what research was needed to make that possible and to make that successful. And we've then, since then been developing up research projects that focus on those priority areas. Now, yet one of the things that you have to recognise is that management, the process operates at multiple spatial scales. There are different things happening at different spatial scales, and management has to respond to those different management scales. So you can think of an individual reef, and on that reef you will have a population of Crown-of-Thorns starfish. They are going through their standard population processes. They settle, they grow, they reproduce, they eat coral, the coral dies, so on and so forth. Management will need to respond at that level. But there's also a dispersal process where larvae are, the animals are spawning and larvae are spreading up and down the reef. And management can also respond at that scale. And then there's what's happening at the GBR as a whole. So we need to be thinking about different scales of management for the different scales of ecological process that are happening. And we have focused at this stage of the game at what we'll call the local area, the site, the local area, and the regional scale. And we've defined those in this order. The regional scale is that scale of dispersal. And from a management perspective, of larval dispersal. And from a management perspective, understanding that process in space and in time allows us to decide where we need to go to manage Crown-of-Thorns starfish. Once we know where we need to go, there's a reef or a set of reefs that we want to visit, we need to know what do we do when we get there. What are the set of individual sites across that area that we want to visit? And when we get to an individual site, we need to know what it is that's going to make us successful at those sites. So there are different decisions at each of those processes. And here, the blue boxes represent management actions or management goals, site control, local area and regional control. If you can pull those off, you can then start to think about managing new outbreaks and existing outbreaks at larger spatial scales and potentially at the GBR scale as a whole. Feeding or supporting the decisions that have to be made at each of those scales, we have a couple of different research areas in the program. The first of these is looking at site strategy. What do you do at individual sites? When is control going to be successful at that individual site? Looking at the local area, where in that local area do you go to manage? Where are you going to get the best bang for your buck given a set of goals or objectives? And then at the regional scale, where are you best investing your effort at that larger spatial scale? Those are important decision processes that managers are making every day when they're sending boats out and divers into the water. So how can we help them make those decisions most effectively? But also we have to think about the tools that are being used out there. Currently injecting the animals work with oxbile salts works well, killing individual animals, but ultimately can we afford to continue to invest at that scale? And so we have a program of research which is looking at developing new technologies for control, technologies that will either supplement or support the methods that we're currently using. So when you boil, this is essentially the same figure, just expanded out to include all of the different sub-projects that are operating at this stage of the game. It's a pretty complex picture. So at that site level, I'm going to work through those decisions at those first three scales in order, and then I'll just give you a brief overview of some of the other projects that we're doing at this stage of the game. So the first question is, can we actually successfully manage Crown-of-Thorns at the scale of a site? If we can't do that, that's the basic building block of any program. If we can't manage a site, then actually we probably can't achieve Crown-of-Thorns management at any spatial scale. So it'd be nice if it was possible, and it's very nice that the answer is sure, we can actually do that. If you look at the plot over on the left, what we've got is, this is data from the AMTO control program, and on the x-axis is the total number of visits to a single site, and on the y-axis is mean coral cover at those sites in 2017. This is after 4 or 5 years of control at individual sites. As you can see there is a significant and positive relationship there. The more visits you have to a site, the more coral you're likely to have at that site at this stage of the game. But the other thing that probably pretty much everyone has noticed is there's a huge amount of variation around that. And there's clearly a whole lot of stuff going on there. And so one focus of the work that we're currently doing is saying, we are being successful, but what is influencing it and what else is going on at these sites? And there's a whole range of different things that contribute to this. We know that zoning has an impact. We know that bleaching has an impact. We know that the location on the reef has an impact. Visitation intervals. So on the right plot on the right-hand side, you can see again, mean coral cover in 2017, and then plotted on the x-axis is the mean visit interval between visits. The shorter the interval, the more likely you are to have higher levels of coral cover. The longer the interval, the less likely. So they're just an example of a range of things that we know are actually impacting on the success of individual sites. Identifying what those things are will help making decisions about how to prioritise those individual sites and what to do in those places. But as I said earlier, well, I haven't said this perhaps, but sites aren't managed in isolation. So when these boats go out, they don't go to a single site. They go to a set of reefs. It might be a dozen reefs, and they visit individual sites on those reefs to do their control. And that means that on any individual voyage, they have to decide which reefs do they go to, which parts of those reefs do they go to do their control. Again, you've got decisions at two spatial scales there. So in the second part, look at the interaction and how to optimise that. So one part of that has been to look at the role of surveillance. Originally, the boats were just going out to these sites and throwing divers in the water, and they were finding what they were finding. And we asked the question of whether doing a bit of surveillance at the beginning, taking some of that effort out of actual control and investing it in surveillance would actually improve the performance of the program. And so we used a series of models to look at the benefits of investing not all your resources into control, but into control and surveillance. And essentially what we found, we did our modelling using the historical data from the control program. And essentially we found that no matter how many divers you had on a boat, and that's quite variable from one voyage to the next, it always paid to invest some amount of effort into surveillance. And on the average voyage, what you ended up seeing was a 33% increase in the number of animals that were removed or killed on a trip. And interestingly, it didn't really matter how well you did the surveillance. A quick and dirty job turned out to be just as good as a really intensive, careful surveillance job. And so recommendation from that, and it's something that's now being applied in each of these voyages, is that when you arrive in an area, divers jump in the water, but a small group of divers go scooting off, and they do a quick run around the reefs in the area, and they figure out where the highest densities are and the best sites for divers to do their following dives. But skippers on boats and the planners of voyages also have to decide which reefs and which parts of that local area that the boats need to visit. And we've used a similar process here, models of cost populations at that scale of tens of kilometres running against models of boats to develop up an app that can be run on a computer back in the office, but also something that can be run on a handheld device out on the water. And the idea behind this is twofold. First, we want to provide an environment in which planners can review the history of management in a particular area. We wanted to provide a tool that would make suggestions about how they should design a particular trip. And we wanted that tool to also be useful in terms of collecting the data and updating predictions during a voyage. And essentially what we've got now in a version that is about to go out on the water and be trialled in the next couple of weeks is what Cameron Fletcher is calling the COTS Control Centre. And it has those three modules. It runs on an Android app as well as on your laptop. And has a number of different modules. The first allows you to review data. You can look at all of the voyages that have been conducted in the history of the control program. You can look at exactly what reefs were visited during those voyages, and you can look right down to individual dives and get information about the number of animals that were encountered and killed, etc. You can then identify reefs or sites that you have to visit and the program will run through, and based on information up to that point in time, will tell you where you're most likely to get the best bang for your buck, and make suggestions about the most efficient sequence of reefs or route that the voyage should travel on. In another module is when divers come out of the water, you can enter the data directly into this device that standardises the data input, which is really important. The data up till now has been really, really messy and very hard to work with. This standardises the input. It automatically updates the database and automatically recalculates what the optimal voyage is, so that if you're out there and you've got bad weather and you can't visit particular locations, you can incorporate the data that you collected that morning into the prediction of the best place for you to go in the next phase of the trip. Stepping up in the next part of the project, we're stepping up to that scale, looking at the regional scale processes. And here we're building off work that's been done by AIMS, JCU, CSIRO, and UQ researchers in the past. And this is essentially they've developed up models of connectivity of reefs for cots and coral, and with the idea of understanding that network and how different reefs are connected in terms of those processes. We can take that information and use that information to identify the priority reefs for management. So if, for example, we know that we want to go to the reefs that have the highest export of cots larvae, we can use population models of cots populations at individual reefs, combine those with the connectivity models produced in this previous work, and say, well, the reefs in red shown here between Cairns and Townsville should be the priority reefs for that particular objective. But we can also make that sort of a process much more complex. We can say, well, we're not just interested in reefs which have lots of cots, we're also interested in reefs which are important sources of coral, so important sources of recovery for downstream areas. And so we can go through a similar process using a more complex objective. And in this particular, not in this example, but in this example, the reefs that are in red are reefs that have high coral output, but are also at high risk of being attacked by Crown-of-Thorns Starfish, whereas the reefs that are blue have a high coral output, but low risk of COTS attack, and the reefs in grey are neither of those things. So again, it's at a different spatial scale. It's a tool which at the moment we do manually, but it allows voyage planners and decision makers to identify the key reefs in that need to be visited. Ideally, by the end of the project, what we'll have is an automated version of this which updates with annual models based on this year's weather and current predictions. So those are the major decision support tools that we're developing in this work. We have a range of other projects that are supporting the different aspects of that. For example, in the control area, we're looking at a variety of methods that either support or supplement the current methods. These include things like supporting predator populations, looking at the potential of triton aquaculture and seeding on the reef, looking at indirect effects like whether zoning would have an impact on COTS populations. But we're also looking at new technologies themselves, things along the lines of attractants. This is work coming out of AIMS, which might attract COTS to particular locations to make them easier to kill, and new technologies for application to biocontrol. Another area that we're having a quick look at is deep water habitat. We manage COTS in the top 15, sometimes 20 metres of water, but we know they go deeper, and we know there's lots of reef down there. Are we just skimming the COTS off the surface? Is the real activity happening down below? How important is that deeper water? We don't know exactly how much is there. We don't know how many COTS are down there. So part of this work is also figuring out just how important that deep water habitat might be. And with work based on AIMS and CSIRO, past AIMS and CSIRO work, we're looking at developing up new techniques for first detecting new outbreaks, designing strategies for a monitoring program and the technologies that we need for that, and also technologies and approaches for delimiting or mapping existing outbreaks. At the moment, we don't actually have a very good picture of where existing outbreaks are. If we had a good picture of that, we could much more efficiently use our resources by sending them to the most important areas. So both of these are projects that will be coming on in the next round of funding for this work. All right, so I think my 20 minutes is up, actually, so I won't go through my summary slide, but it's a big and complex project, and I think the key thing here is that we're really focusing on trying to get research into management. We're trying to develop the tools that allow that to happen, rather than simply hoping that it's going to happen in a sort of evolutionary kind of a way. Thanks.